Monday, the 4th of March 1991. Jon Fuller leaned back in the uncomfortable blue plastic moulded chair. He'd been left waiting in the little room for what felt like hours. Though the plain white clock on the wall, above the ridiculously large mirror, showed that, in reality, it had only been just over 20 minutes. His frustration was beginning to turn to anger now. They'd specifically asked him to come in at 10:30 a.m. He'd even arrived 10 minutes early. A police officer had taken him through the station to this small interview room, offered him a coffee, and left him here. Had Jon known he'd be waiting here for half the morning, he would not have said yes. His fingers drummed against his thighs as he exhaled slowly. Christ, he thought to himself. I could kill for a cigarette. He felt a sudden pang of guilt at that thought. How could he think of such a thing after everything that had happened? Perhaps it was just more grief. It did seem to pile upon him, like earth being tipped into a grave. His grave, covering him and suffocating him. That constant dark shadow that clawed at him throughout his waking hours, tearing at the thin walls of his sanity. Whenever he managed to find sleep here and there, albeit for an hour or so only, he would find his dreams consumed by nightmares. Damn it, he pondered. Why the hell would they not have an ashtray in this hovel? He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a pack of cigarettes in his chrome lighter. He placed one of the cigarettes between his lips, clicked the button on his lighter, and a small blue and orange flame ignited, like a tiny jet engine. Defiantly, he lit the cigarette and inhaled deeply, enjoying the taste as the smoke filled his lungs. The door to the small interview room opened inwards, and a stout, portly man with thinning hair and a greying, bushy moustache stepped inside. An immaculately dressed younger woman in a suit jacket and matching skirt followed closely behind, her face plain and pale, and her long auburn hair pulled tight behind her in a ponytail. Jon sat up straight in his chair. "Detective Inspector," he said, failing to keep his frustration from seeping into his tone. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me." Detective Inspector James Minks placed a small glass ashtray onto the table, pulled out a chair, and sat himself down in front of Jon. "My sincere apologies, Mr. Fuller," he said, as he reached into the brown suit jacket that seemed a size or two too large for him and retrieved a polished wooden pipe. He gestured over to his companion, who was placing a tape recorder on the table and seating herself to his left. "This is Detective Sergeant DeWitt," he said. "Do forgive me. I don't recall if you two have met." Jon reached over to the ashtray and gently tapped the cigarette into it. "Yes, we have met," he replied. He shot the older man a slightly puzzled look. "You were there." D.I. Minks smiled as he struck a match and lit his pipe. "Ah, silly me, of course," he said. He leaned across the table and pressed the record button. "The date is Monday the 4th of March 1991, and it is now 10:55 a.m. This is Detective Inspector James Minks and Detective Sergeant Victoria DeWitt interviewing Mr. Jonathan Fuller." "I didn't know this was going to be so formal," Jon said, as he leaned back in his chair once again, eyeing the detective cautiously. Detective Minks smiled kindly, his large grey eyes brimming with sympathy. "My apologies, Mr. Fuller. There's naught for you to worry about. We just have to be extra thorough these days, what with all these young lasses going missing recently." He eyed Jon suspiciously, just for the briefest of moments. Jon suspected he was not supposed to have noticed, but he had. "Now, I know you've already given a statement, but it does help me to go through these things in person. And of course, There's no chance of me missing anything if it's all recorded." He sat forward, resting his forearms on the table and tapping his pipe 3 times against his wrist. "I understand that this is exceedingly difficult for you, Mr. Fuller, but if you could, please take us back to the night of the 17th. Tell me exactly what happened." Sunday, the 17th of February, 1991. The rain hammered down from the cold sky as John stepped out of his car. By the time he'd crossed the hospital car park to the reception entrance, his clothes were soaked through, and his dark brown hair was plastered across his face. From across the waiting area, he saw his mother-in-law. She sat stooped over in a chair, her head bowed and her face in her hands. He stepped forwards to approach her, but was stopped by a hand that caught his arm. He spun around to find his father-in-law holding him tightly. "Johnny," was all he could say, as his grip became harder still. "Roger," John gasped. "What happened?" He tried to keep his voice calm and level. "Where's Sarah?" It was only now that he truly noticed the older man's face. Where he had always known there to be a sparkle and a cheeky, mischievous grin, he now saw utter despair. Red, blotchy eyes, sunken into a ghostly pale, exhausted face. The man looked a good decade older than his years. He grabbed Roger by the lapels of his jacket and shook him. "Where is she?" He was shouting now. Panic was beginning to sear into his heart, and he needed an answer before it overwhelmed him. The older man shook his head. "She's gone, son," he croaked. He tried to say more, but the words would not come. Fresh tears began to fill the older man's eyes anew. "You can't mean," John began, but Roger could only bow his head. His voice cracked as he tried to reply. "She was up at Maiden's Point. She fell from the rocks." Saying the words seemed to break him. "She drowned." He finally allowed himself to lose composure, and the tears ran free and unrelenting. John felt his limbs become suddenly numb as the words sank into his consciousness. He didn't remember the ground racing up at him, but he found himself sprawled across the cold, hard floor. The room was spinning. His stomach somersaulted inside, and he retched, leaving a small puddle of bile beside him. He felt hands upon him then, before he was hoisted to his feet and taken over to a chair. People were speaking to him, but their voices were muffled and incomprehensible. "I need to see my wife," he managed to say, as a plastic cup of water was placed into his trembling hands. "No, son, you don't want to do that." He had no idea who had spoken to him. He could barely even make out the words. They seemed to drift to him through some vast thick fog that distorted the sound. "You can't stop me from seeing her." He almost snarled the words. Roger appeared before him, kneeling down to look into his eyes. "No, John," he said, exhausted. "But she..." His voice trailed off, his lips quivering as he tried to find the words. "She's not..." Again, he stopped. Eventually, he composed himself, took a deep, shuddering breath, and spoke firmly. "John, I had to identify her from her birthmark." He paused, trying to steady himself. "They say it was the rocks." John let out a long, pained cry as he held on tightly to his father-in-law, gripping the man by his shoulders. Roger embraced him, and for a few long moments they remained that way. "Emily," he blurted out suddenly. "Robbie!" He looked around frantically, dropping the small plastic cup, its contents spilling across his shoes. "The kids are all right," Roger said, as he held John's face in his hands. "They're with your granddad and your brother." John could not reply. He just glared in desperation at the older man. "I promise you, Johnny, they're safe and sound." For the briefest of moments, relief flushed through his body, only to be replaced by more waves of despair. He tried to speak, but no words left his lips. Roger embraced him once again, and the two men fell into each other and wept, neither man wanting to let go, for fear of the reality that would come crashing down upon them after. Monday, the 18th of February, 1991. The sound of the front doorbell shook John from his dazed, zombie-like state. He lay upon his bed, staring thoughtlessly at the ceiling. He had no idea for how long. It had been dark when he'd fallen into bed, but it was certainly light outside now. He could not really remember the journey back from the hospital. Roger had driven him here in silence. Neither man had anything to say to each other. Roger had seemed to be operating purely on autopilot, his movements mechanical, his eyes glazed over, almost as if he were blind. The doorbell rang out again. Slowly, John rose from the soft mattress that he had always shared with his Sarah and rubbed at the back of his aching neck. He stood, stumbled across the room to the door, and stepped out onto the landing. Once more came the ding-dong from the front door. John swore aloud and regretted it immediately, as a vicious pain lanced through his skull. He remembered getting headaches as a child, after excessive crying due to some petty nonsense. But this was different, though. There was nothing petty about this. He hurried down the stairs, cursing silently as he almost tripped halfway. He reached the front door and pulled it open, wincing as the bright sunlight bore into his swollen, bloodshot eyes. After a few moments, his eyes adjusted to the brightness, though it still caused a tsunami of agony in his head, forcing him to lean heavily on the wooden door frame. "My God, John." The voice was warm, yet laced with sadness. John's vision was clearing, but he already knew who had called upon him. The voice was that of his oldest friend, a tall, slender man with flowing blonde hair by the name of Samuel Bell. They'd been as close as brothers since they were boys, running around the school playground and getting into every kind of mischief possible. But now, in their late 30s, they were still as close as they ever were, and they both knew that they could rely upon the other should they ever be in need of it. John tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. His tongue felt like sandpaper as it scraped the roof of his mouth, and only a rasping sound clawed out of him. He held out a hand, and his friend stepped forward, embracing him tightly. "I got you, bro," Samuel said reassuringly as John sobbed into his shoulder. "I promise you we'll get you through this. It's wrong and it's cruel, but you can do it." Gently, Samuel steered his friend back into the house and through to the kitchen. John slumped onto one of the high stools at the breakfast bar as Samuel began to fill the kettle from the kitchen sink. After a moment, he looked around the room. "Where are the kids?" he asked, flicking the switch on the kettle. "They're at Grandad's," John sighed. "They stayed there last night." He held his head in his hands. "I've not even seen them yet. What must they be going through? I'm not even there for them." "Dude, don't do that to yourself," Samuel said instantly. "They're both safe and being well cared for." He stepped across the kitchen and laid a supportive hand on his friend's shoulder. "Listen, how about this? We have a cuppa and I'll drive us both over there," Samuel said, giving John's shoulder a firm squeeze. "Yeah," came the simple reply. "Gotta do it eventually, and they'll be needing me. Sooner is better." They drove across town in silence, arriving 10 minutes later at 19 Crest Place. Samuel pulled into the house's short driveway besides John's brother's car, and cut the engine off. Memories flooded into John's mind as he looked upon his old childhood home. His parents had died in a traffic collision when he and his brother were just children, and their grandparents had welcomed them in with open arms. John had lived there happily until the day he left for university to study art history. His younger brother, however, had never left. He left school at the age of 16, choosing to work as soon as he could. He'd never been academically gifted, and had spent most of his time at secondary school, smoking with his friends and chasing after the affections of his female classmates. It had turned out to be something of a blessing, however. Their grandma Edna had passed away a little over 6 years ago, and it had hit their granddad hard. It was good that he had Tom there to help him and support him through the worst of it. John closed the passenger side door of the car and trudged the rest of the way up the drive. "Emily hates coming here," he said as he knocked. "I hope she's not too mad at me." "I think that'll be the last thing on her mind right now," Samuel said, patting his friend upon the back. After only a few moments, the door opened before them. Tom stood in the doorway, a sorrowful look upon his pale face. "Hey, John," he said. "I'm so sorry." He reached out a hand and awkwardly touched John upon the arm. "I've literally just heard. I only got in about 5 minutes ago." He stepped to one side and ushered the two newcomers into the house. "The kids are in the living room with Grandad. Come on through." As he stepped into the room, John's eyes instantly met those of his 13-year-old daughter. She jumped up from the sofa and ran into his arms. He held her tightly as she buried her face into his thick woolen jumper. Robbie, his 7-year-old son, was sat upon the knee of Grandad Arthur. The old man was doing his best to comfort the small boy, but Robbie's eyes were glazed over and staring into nothingness. "You ready to go home, love?" John said gently to his daughter. Without pulling her face away from his chest, she nodded. "Okay," he said, easing her from him. "Go on out to the car and—" He was cut off as she clung to him once more, this time tighter still. "All right, let's just get your brother." The old man was stroking Robbie's back. "Look here, lad," he said warmly. "Who's this come to see you?" Arthur looked up at his grandson with cloudy eyes as he moved closer. "He's all right, Johnny," he said reassuringly. "I think it's shock." The old man seemed to ponder for the briefest of moments. "I think he saw what happened. Poor little beggar." "Thanks, Grandad. I can't tell you how much I appreciate this," John replied. Arthur stared up at his grandson quizzically. "What's that now?" he replied blankly. John noticed the old man did not have his hearing aids in. He smiled thinly and just waved the question away. "Sorry, lad," Arthur added. "I forgot to put my hearing aid on." "Well, that makes a change," said John with an eye roll, as he turned his attention to the little boy currently sat on the old man's knee. Arthur looked thoroughly confused now, but John chose to ignore it. Robbie seemed to notice his father for the first time then. His wide brown eyes gazed up unblinking. "She saw the girl," he said, almost in a whisper. "What, son?" said John, as he dropped to one knee in front of the boy. "She saw someone," Robbie said once more, "on the rocks. She went to help them." His eyes wandered slowly to stare over John's shoulder, once more into nothingness. "She didn't come back." John scooped the boy from Arthur's leg, holding him on his right hip. "It's okay, mate. Don't worry. Everything's going to be all right." He felt like a fraud saying that. It was a lie. Nothing was ever going to be okay again. But he had to say it. He had to say the things that his children needed to hear, no matter how hard it might be to believe them. Tuesday, the 19th of February, 1991. Jon awoke with a start to the sound of loud sobbing. He sighed, rubbing the sleep from his bleary eyes, before sitting up and looking at the alarm clock on his bedside table. The clock read 2:32 a.m. Jon swore under his breath as he raised himself from the sheets and fumbled his slippers onto his feet. As he stepped into the gloom of the hallway, he saw Emily standing outside her brother's bedroom. In her pink cotton nightdress, her thin frame was nothing more than a silhouette in the dim moonlight. "It's all right, love," Jon said, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. "I'll settle him down." She looked up at him, a puzzled expression on her face. "I think he was talking to someone just now," she whispered, clearly worried. "I mean," she paused. "I could only hear him talking, but it was like he was talking to someone." Jon slid his arm around her shoulder and pulled her in close to him, before gently kissing her on top of the head. She seemed to stiffen suddenly in his embrace, and he instinctively let her go. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Go back to bed now. I'll look after him." She nodded solemnly, before turning and moving back across the landing. She stopped, turning to face him once again. "Dad?" she called, ever so slightly louder than a whisper. He turned his head to look back at her, his hand clasped around the door handle to Robbie's room. "Yes, love?" he replied just as quietly. She hesitated, before slowly shaking her head. "Nothing," she said, looking down at her feet. Seemingly defeated, she vanished back into her own room, closing the door behind her. Jon gently eased the door to Robbie's bedroom open and stepped inside. The room was pitch dark, and it took him a moment to get his bearings. As his eyes adapted to the lack of light, he could make out his son standing next to his bed, struggling to strip the sheets onto the floor. "Robbie?" said Jon as he stepped towards the boy. "What are you doing?" Robbie looked back at his father, tears streaming from his eyes. "It's all wet," he cried out. "It's not my fault. It's not. It's not." Jon took the bedding from his son's hands. "It's all right, mate. It's not a problem. We can change your bedding." He felt the sheets, searching for the wet spot, but it was bone dry. He raised it to his face, searching for the scent of urine, but to no avail. "Robbie," he looked up from the cotton sheet in his hand. "It's not wet, buddy." Robbie collapsed into a heap upon the floor. "It is," he snapped angrily. Jon held the sheet out for his son to inspect for himself. "It's not wet, mate," he said. "I promise you." Robbie looked up at his father, his face angry, his cheeks red and blotchy. "What's wrong with you?" he shouted. "Why can't you feel it?" The boy began to sob uncontrollably, his eyes shut tight as he beat the floor with his fists. Jon moved up beside his son, dropping to one knee. He put a firm hand on Robbie's shoulder. "Robbie, it's all right. I promise you, it's going to be all right." Robbie let out a guttural scream as he tried to curl up into a fetal position. "Why won't you leave me alone?" he cried out. "Go away. Leave me alone." Jon felt utterly defeated. He stood up and turned for the door, but felt the small arms of his son wrap around his leg. "No!" screamed Robbie. "Don't leave me, Daddy. Don't go." Jon leaned down and scooped the boy up into his arms. He held him tight, and Robbie simply cried into his shoulder. He carried his son out of the room and took him back to bed with him, where he lay holding him tightly as he wept, until eventually he began to sleep. Monday, the 4th of March, 1991. Detective Inspector Minks rubbed at the stubble on his chin. "This person," he said with a suspicious gleam in his eye. "The one your son said your wife saw. Did he describe them at all?" "No, he didn't actually see anyone himself." John paused. "I simply thought he must be mistaken. Do you think whoever it was might have something to do with Sarah's death?" The inspector frowned down at the table, as if he was searching for something that wasn't there. Eventually, his eyes met John's again. "I think it all sounds a little suspicious for my liking, Mr. Fuller." "What do you mean?" John tried to keep the weariness from his tone. "Well," Minks cleared his throat before continuing, "ordinarily we'd put something like this down to being just a horrific accident." He leaned forwards with his hands together on the table, the fingers interlocking. "But then there's all these young lasses going missing all over the place." The detective inspector's eyes seemed to bore into John's very soul, his glare both accusing and intense. "Only just over a month ago, we had a double murder in a pub in town. Some poor lass is still missing from that night." John nodded slowly. "Yes," he agreed. "I saw it on the news." "You're no closer to finding her, then?" "Her name is Tracy Smith." The detective inspector failed to hide the frustration in his voice. "We are still looking into some leads, so don't you fret." Detective Minks leaned back in his chair once more. Reaching into his pocket, he retrieved his box of matches and relit his pipe. 10 girls in the last 6 years, Mr. Fuller. You best believe we're looking into any and every lead that rears its ugly head." The two men had locked eyes as the inspector spoke, leading to an uncomfortable, uneasy silence. Eventually John broke eye contact and looked down at the table. "It's just odd, you see," said the inspector, still staring intently at John. When he received nothing back from the younger man, he continued. 10 girls missing, I said, didn't I?" Still John refused to respond. "Well, that's not quite right, really." He slid a photograph across the table. A pretty young girl with a kind smile and long jet black hair was suddenly staring up at John. "Recognize her, Mr. Fuller?" John looked up at the detective. "Should I?" he asked simply. "Amelia Collingwood." Minks allowed the name to hang in the air for a few long seconds. "She disappeared on December the 1st last year. She was just 15 years old." John looked down at the picture again. Yes, he did recognize the girl. She had been on the news non-stop for days. "You found her at Maiden's Point," John said, looking back up at the inspector. "I saw it on the news." "Where were you, Mr. Fuller?" Minks asked accusingly. "When your wife was being battered against the rocks and drowning at that same location. Where were you?" John looked up in shock. "I beg your pardon?" he replied, almost unable to believe what had just been said to him. "I was alone, at home working." He paused to calm the anger that had spiked within him. "And I would appreciate you not speaking so glibly about my wife's passing." The detective inspector raised his hand apologetically. "I had no intention of coming across in such a way, believe me." He paused for a moment. "Those rocks are most treacherous, but even so, the damage done to your poor wife seems overly excessive. It was violent and almost malicious to an extreme." "She was dashed against the rocks. Surely you would expect—" The detective cut him off. "Oh yes," he spoke slowly and precisely. But this was more, Mr. Fuller. Your wife's face was pulverized, her limbs bent and broken in the most unnatural of positions. The older man's words faded away as he remembered seeing the young woman being dragged from the ocean and onto the beach that afternoon. It was a sight that would haunt him to his grave. And you want to know where I was that day? Am I under some kind of suspicion, Detective? Detective Inspector Mink seemed to snap out of a trance. I don't know, Mr. Fuller. He raised an eyebrow. Should you be? A look of anger flashed across John's face. I've had enough of this. He stood abruptly, tipping the chair over to lay on the floor behind him. If I'm not being detained in any way, then I would like to go. Of course, you are free to go, but don't go far. We may have more questions in the future. John stared down at the older man with fury in his eyes. I've got 2 grieving children at home with me, he snapped. Where the hell am I gonna go? He spat the last words across the table. With that, Sergeant DeWitt stood and escorted John out of the room, as Detective Inspector Mink sat puffing on his pipe, a look of determined concentration on his face. John arrived home feeling utterly defeated. He opened the front door and slumped against the doorframe, almost too weary to step inside. Samuel walked from the kitchen into the hallway. Hey mate, how was it at the station? He asked. John let out a huge sigh. I don't know, he answered, exasperated. It's like they think I had something to do with what happened. Samuel's mouth gaped open in surprise. I'm sure it's nothing, John continued, as he made his way past his friend down the hall. They're clutching at straws. I don't think they know what they're doing. He stepped into the living room, to find his son sat next to Samuel's wife on the sofa. Hi Alice, didn't expect to see you here, he said with a hollow smile. Alice looked over to him, her pretty eyes glassy with expectant tears. Hi John, she said, unable to hide the pain in her voice. I thought I'd come over and help Sam look after the kids while you were out. She paused, her pale face a mask of concern and grief. John, I'm so sorry, she began, but John raised a hand to stop her. It's all right, Alice, I know. For fear of coming across as rude, he continued. Thank you for coming over. I don't know what I'd do without you guys. Samuel appeared with a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Passing it to his friend, he smiled. You don't ever need to thank us, he said as John took the mug from him. Now get that down you. John blew lightly over the top of the mug as he took in the rest of the room. Alice and Robbie had been watching a movie on the television, one of the many video cassettes that Sarah had bought for the kids. He was not a fan of films himself. He always preferred a good documentary. Anything about history or nature would have him hooked. It was always Sarah that had loved cinema. She would tell him how magical it was to be transported somewhere else for a couple of hours. Somewhere where she could forget all her worries and the stresses of everyday life. His eyes continued to scan the room. His daughter was not there. Where's Emily? He asked. Upstairs? Samuel shook his head. No, she had a call from her friend Maxine. She asked if she could stay over there tonight, so I dropped her round earlier. Samuel swallowed. She said you'd be okay with it. You are, aren't you? John nodded slowly. Yeah, he said finally. Max is her best mate. It'll do her good to spend some time with her. Did she say when she was going to be back? Yes, Samuel replied. She's going to walk back here first thing when her friend goes to school. Tuesday, the 12th of March, 1991. Jon lay silently in his bed, once again his eyes staring blindly into the dark gloom of the ceiling. His right hand slid across the sheets to where Sarah should have been sleeping beside him. He took a long, deep shuddering breath. "I miss you," he murmured aloud. "You're supposed to be here with me." He rolled over to face Sarah's side of the bed, hoping with all his being that she would miraculously be there, lying next to him. His heart seemed to stop for the briefest of moments as he stared across the sheets. He thought he saw a black shape in the open doorway leading out onto the landing. He strained his eyes, trying to make out what it could be, but it was too dark. The hairs on his arms suddenly stood to attention as he heard the creak of the floorboards. The sound of dripping water filled his mind, and he could detect the strongest scent of the sea. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, his tongue rough and cracked like a dried-up riverbed. The shape that loomed within the doorway seemed to shift lumberingly as it lurched into the room. The sound of dripping water became louder, as if a dam had cracked and was just waiting to burst open, to fill the room and drown him there and then. The shape struggled closer to the bed. He could make out more of it now. It staggered forwards on legs that were bent in the most sickening of ways, reaching out with one spasming hand that extended awkwardly from a twisted broken arm. The other arm hung tattered and torn at its side. The air suddenly became damp and oppressive, the figure now leaning over him. He could make out a mop of tangled wet hair that seemed to explode uncontrollably from the figure's head. As it clasped its cold wet fingers around his arm and eased itself into the bed beside him, he could see its face for the first time. Or at least, what should have been its face. Its lower jaw hung loosely from the rest of its skull, many of its teeth either broken or missing. Above the jaw, there was nothing. No features, just a gruesome hole, as if someone had repeatedly dug into it with a spoon, scooping out what was there until nothing was left. Ice-cold water gushed from the hole, spilling over the lolling tongue to drench Jon's chest and sheets. A pained moan seemed to vibrate from the creature as it moved under the sheets and wrapped itself around him, its broken jaw resting over his ever faster beating heart. Jon realized he had not taken a single breath since he'd first seen the being in his doorway, and he gasped aloud. He awoke with a start, lathered in sweat and desperately trying to catch his breath. Sitting bolt upright, he tossed the soaked sheets aside, half expecting to see that deformed wretch still clinging to him. Thankfully, there was nothing there. He stepped from the bed and stood for some moments, the room seeming to spin as he steadied himself. He felt his belly lurch inside him, and suddenly he heaved. Desperately, he staggered out onto the landing and across to the bathroom. Falling to his knees before the toilet, he loudly emptied the contents of his stomach. Exhausted, Jon fell back against the wall, his head cushioned by the toilet roll that hung from its dispenser. His chest ached from the effort of being sick, and his skin glistened in the bright moonlight that shone into the room through the bathroom window. He opened his eyes and froze. Sitting in the bathtub, directly opposite where he half lay on the floor, he saw his son. "Robbie?" His throat was dry and sore, so the words came from his lips like a rasp. His son did not answer. He simply stared straight ahead into his father's eyes, unblinking. Eventually, Jon mustered up the strength to crawl towards the bathtub and placed his hands upon the rim to support his weight. "Robbie," his voice croaked. "It's okay. It's Daddy." He reached out a hand, gently holding his son by the arm. His pajamas were soaking wet. Jon jumped as his son suddenly sprung to life. The little boy's arms shot up, his hands pushing into Jon's mouth. Jon could feel icy water shooting down his throat and into his lungs. He tried to pull away, but he was fixed to the spot. He tried to scream as he watched Robbie's eyes roll back into his skull, water pulsing from the sockets. The boy's mouth opened wide, revealing blackened teeth and tongue. More water bubbled up from his throat to spill down his chin as a loud gargling moan filled the room, getting louder and louder. Jon could feel himself about to pass out, his lungs exploding in pain as they filled with freezing cold water, the noise vibrating inside his head. He awoke with a start on the sofa, coughing and spluttering as he tried to take in his surroundings. The living room was cloaked in darkness. Jon's heart was racing. He felt as if it might erupt from his chest at any moment. Concentrating, he tried to calm his breathing, before blindly reaching across the coffee table in front of him. His fingers fumbled over his cigarette and lighter as he gingerly stood up before making his way through to the front door. Stepping out into the cold night, he lit a cigarette, hoping that it would steady his thumping heart. Jon did not manage to sleep again that night. He found himself simply sitting in front of whatever garbage TV show was on, not taking any of it in, but still happy for the distraction. Robbie had not stirred so far, and Jon had decided to let the boy rest. God knows he had earned it. He checked his watch. It was now 7:58 a.m. Maxine would need to be at school for around 8:30, so Jon guessed his daughter would arrive home sometime just after 9. He would make her a nice sweet tea for when she no doubt came stumbling in exhausted. She would like that. At 9 a.m. Jon put the kettle on, and by 9:06 a.m. he had a hot piping cup of tea sat ready on the kitchen counter. 9:06 soon became 9:30, and then it was 10:05. The cup of tea now sat cold in the kitchen, destined to be tipped away down the sink. By the time Jon's watch read 11 a.m., he had begun to panic. He picked up the telephone receiver from the kitchen wall and called the number marked as Maxine in the small address book. The line rang for several painfully long moments, until there came the voice of Maxine's mother. "Hello?" She sounded happy and carefree. Jon tried to keep his voice steady. "Hi, Sally," he began. "It's Jon, Emily's dad. Is she still at yours by any chance?" There was a long pause. Jon could feel his hands shaking. "Hi, Jon," came the eventual reply. "No, the girls both left earlier for school. She should be home by now." Jon's voice cracked as he spoke next, betraying his distress. "She's not home yet. Did Max get to school okay?" he asked. "I'll call the school right away and call you back in a minute." The line clicked as Sally hung up the phone on her end. Jon replaced the receiver and leaned heavily on the kitchen counter as Robbie sulked into the room, rubbing sleepily at his right shoulder. The boy helped himself to a bowl from the cupboard and began fixing himself some breakfast. Jon had gone completely numb. He stood feeling nauseous, listening to his son shovel cereal into his mouth. After a while the phone rang. Jon grabbed for it immediately. "Sally?" he blurted out. "Yes, it's me, Jon." Sally's voice was calm. That had to be a good sign, surely. "I called the school. Maxine's there in her lesson." Sally paused. "She said she walked there with Emily. She said she was heading straight home. John's heart fell into his stomach. He could barely hear Sally calling out to him as he slowly lowered the receiver back into its cradle. He felt giddy. He swayed on the spot, holding onto the counter for support. He continuously told himself silently that she's mourning. She's not thinking straight. She'd just gone for a walk to clear her head. He wanted to call the police, to report her missing. But you had to wait for 24 hours, didn't you? Or was it 48? Did that still apply for minors? Eventually, he reached into his pocket, took out his wallet, and produced a white business card. It had been given to him by Sergeant DeWitt as he had left the police station. Printed upon it was the name of Detective Inspector James Minks. The clock on the living room wall read 17 minutes past 3 in the afternoon when the doorbell sounded. John raced to the front door and opened it. There on the doorstep stood the detective inspector. "Still no word?" he asked. John shook his head before stepping to one side. "Please come in, detective. Thank you for coming." He was aware of how exhausted he must have sounded, but he did not, however, realize just how bad he looked. John was deathly pale, with thick dark rings around his eyes. Unshaven, and his hair was an unkempt mess upon his head. He wore an old pair of jogging trousers and a grey t-shirt covered in sweat stains, and he smelled strongly of stale body odour. "You don't look so good, Mr. Fuller," Minks said as he entered the house and followed John into the living room. John mumbled in agreement as he sat down in an armchair and gestured for the detective to do the same. "Under the circumstances, I'm glad you called me directly about this," he said matter-of-factly as he sat down. "The lass has been through a lot. I'm sure she's just wandering around out there somewhere. But these are uncertain times, especially for a young woman." "She's 13, John cut in. "She's a child, not a young woman." For a moment, the detective's features stiffened, a cold dead look in his eyes. The pictures of each of the 10 missing girls from the past 6 years streamed through his mind. It was true that none of them had been as young as Emily Fuller, but not by much. Tracy Smith, the most recent of them, had gone missing in the midst of a bloodbath at the Harbourman pub. She was not much older, just 16 years of age, just a kid herself. Minks attempted a warm smile. "Yes, of course." He cleared his throat. "But that's even more reason to find her quickly. Her description has been circulated, and officers are keeping an eye out for her, but it would help us a great deal if you had a recent picture." That evening, Emily's picture was featured on the local news, along with a plea from Detective Inspector Minks from anyone who might know anything to come forward. Tom had visited earlier in the day with their granddad. Seeing his little brother upon opening the door, John had broken down and embraced the younger man. The two men had sat down on the sofa, Tom cradling his sobbing brother while their granddad disappeared into the kitchen to make some tea. He was not the most comfortable man when it came to high emotions, and figured he'd be of more use that way. "I'm sure they'll find her." Tom rubbed at John's back as he spoke. For a while the pair sat in near silence as John tried to compose himself. His mind was awash with memories of his little princess. The days she'd come screaming into the world. Her first step. Her fascination with the chimpanzees when they'd taken her to the zoo when she was only 3 years old. Her utter glee at the arrival of her baby brother, and all the times they had fought and played together over the years. Eventually, Tom audibly cleared his throat. "What have the police said so far?" he said. "Do they have any leads at all?" John shook his head, his gaze still very much aimed at his own lap. He felt his brother give out a sigh. The frustration was obviously not just his to bear. "We have to remain hopeful," Tom reassured him. Arthur shuffled in with a tray of 3 steaming mugs of tea and a glass of apple juice. "I thought I'd get something for the little man as well," he said as he put the tray down on the coffee table. "Where is he, son? Upstairs?" Jon gestured to the door leading back to the hallway and simply murmured, "Yeah," as a reply. Arthur turned and started back the way he'd come. "I'll give him a shout to come down. It'll be good to see the boy." As Arthur moved towards the staircase, he was surprised to see little Robbie already halfway down, his fingers clinging to the banisters. "There you are, little man," Arthur beamed at his great-grandson. "There's some juice down here for you." "No!" Robbie seemed to strain to get the word out, before turning with some difficulty and retreating up the stairs to disappear onto the landing above. Arthur stood for a moment, rubbing at the white stubble on his chin. He thought about calling after the child, but instead he shook his head in defeat and made his way back towards the living room. Hours passed. Jon looked at his watch with numb indifference. It was nearly 7:15. Robbie had not come down all evening. Jon realized he hadn't made anything for dinner, and yet Robbie had still not ventured downstairs. He couldn't be too surprised. He had no appetite himself. It must be the same for the poor kid. With great effort, Jon heaved himself up out of the sofa. The muscles in his lower back screamed at him in defiance as he moved, and he nearly allowed himself to simply flop back down again. But he persisted. It was almost Robbie's bedtime, and he really needed to have a bath first. Jon was aware that he'd been neglecting his youngest child recently, just as he had his daughter. He had been so consumed by his own grief that he had not wholly been there for either of them. He had put an end to that now, he decided. His son needed him to be there, to be strong and supportive. The poor child had been through more than any kid should ever have to experience, and he'd be damned if he'd let the boy suffer alone. Jon went to the bathroom and began to run the bath, adding a sizable amount of foam to the running water. Robbie had always loved playing in the bubbles at bath time. He went to the airing cupboard and retrieved a large towel before calling out to his son, trying to keep his voice level. "Come on, Robbie, bath time." "Okay," came Robbie's simple reply. Jon returned to the bathroom and shut off the water. He tested the temperature with his hands. Satisfied, he dried it off on a towel, which he placed neatly on the edge of the sink before seating himself upon the toilet lid. Eventually, Robbie shuffled his way into the bathroom, his dressing gown wrapped around him and tied tightly at the waist with a cord. "I can manage," he said, with a slight hint of what Jon could only think of as fear. Jon leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand upon his son's shoulder. "Don't be silly," he said with a smile. "We need to wash your hair, Scruff. You know you never managed to do it properly on your own." Robbie looked sheepishly at the bath and then back at his father. Jon sighed aloud. "Okay, tell you what," he said finally. "You get yourself in the bath, and I'll go downstairs and put the kettle on. We'll have a hot chocolate each before bedtime." Robbie nodded his head slowly, his face still a blank mask. Jon stood up and made his way out of the bathroom, onto the landing, and down the stairs. He returned a couple of minutes later to find his son sitting in the half-filled bath and covered in foam. "You look like a snowman," Jon smiled weakly, but garnered no reaction from the boy sat in the water before him. He knelt beside the bathtub and reached across with a plastic jug that sat next to the taps. Dunking it below the surface, he filled it and raised it over his son's head. "Don't!" A tear ran down Robbie's cheek as he said the word. Jon paused momentarily, but then moved to pour the water down the back of Robbie's head and neck. The boy started to sob. "Please don't," he croaked, as Jon tipped the water. The foam that covered the boy's neck and shoulders was unceremoniously swept away, and Jon recoiled at what he'd uncovered. The boy's upper body was a canvas of black, purple and yellowing bruises. Across one shoulder, running halfway down to his elbow, was a thick, raw-looking scratch that had certainly bled at some point. "My God," was all Jon could say as he scanned the patterned dark blotches that covered his son's back, arms and chest. He blinked several times, as if snapping himself out of a trance. "Robbie," he tried to keep his tone as calm as possible, though he could feel his anger rising. Who the hell had done this to his baby boy? "I need to know how you got these bruises." Robbie simply stared up at him and shook his head as his once expressionless face began to crease with despair. "Please, little man," Jon said. "You need to tell me who did this to you." The child simply shook his head and cried. Jon ran a wet hand through his short dark hair as he leaned back from the side of the tub. "You're not going to be in any trouble. And whoever did this, I will make sure they never touch you again." He paused, waiting for Robbie to speak. Robbie's eyes darted to look at something over Jon's shoulder. He seemed to be focusing intently on something, but when Jon peered back, he saw nothing. "I'll never let anyone hurt you," he was almost pleading with his son now. "Tell me who did this." "She's going to hurt me." Robbie looked down into the bubbles that had gathered over his lap. "Who, Robbie? Who is going to hurt you?" He gently touched the boy's back. "Whoever it is, I won't let them." Robbie sat still for a moment, trying to compose himself as best he could. He looked up at his father, his gaze being dragged once more over Jon's shoulder, before finally locking eyes with him. "It's the girl." Robbie's words came forth in a mere whisper between shuddering breaths. Jon looked at him confused. "The girl Mummy saw on the rocks." Robbie's eyes darted once more to stare over Jon's shoulder. He began to speak faster, as if with real purpose. "Mum saw her, but I couldn't. Then Mummy fell, over and over again onto the rocks. And then I saw her." His eyes were wide with terror now, locked onto whatever it was that Jon was not able to see. "She's here now." He began to cry uncontrollably. "She's always here, staring at me, hurting me." Suddenly, without warning, Robbie screamed, throwing his hands up in front of his face. He seemed to lift slightly from the water as he slammed into the wall beside the bathtub. Robbie cried out for his daddy as he seemed to throw himself forward in the water, his body now bent unnaturally, his head ending up between his outstretched legs. Jon leaned forwards, grasping his son's shoulder and pulling him up out of the water. As Robbie's face broke the surface, he coughed and spluttered, liquid tumbling from his mouth. Jon moved to stand up, pulling his son free from the water before he felt something cold and wet press into his face. He felt himself lifted to his feet and thrown backwards. The back of Jon's head hit the mirror with a sickening thud, creating a web-like pattern in the glass around a smear of blood in its center. He tried to pull himself forward again. Dazed, Jon stumbled towards Robbie, who was now screaming loudly in the bathtub, reaching out for his father. He stretched out a hand to grasp the child's wrist and pull him clear, but something unseen hit him in the side, sending him careening through the bathroom door where he landed in a crumpled heap. With great effort, Jon pulled himself to his feet and headed back towards the bathroom where his son was still screaming, as the door suddenly slammed shut in front of him. He grabbed for the handle, but it would not budge. His heart sunk suddenly as he heard Robbie's screams cut short. Frantically, he began smashing his weight into the door. Swearing aloud, he stumbled back from the door. He readied himself, took a deep breath, and charged forward. The door swung open in front of him, causing him to lose his balance and crash face first into the bathroom sink. He didn't feel his nose shatter against the enamel, or his legs buckle, or even his body collapse to the wet floor. Everything went black as he slipped into nothingness, engulfed in the darkness. Jon awoke in a small puddle of congealing blood. His joints were stiff, and his face ached horribly. He pushed down on the floor and began to rise. His head swam as his surroundings began to spin around him. He reached up to the edge of the bathtub and hauled himself onto his knees. With a gargled cry, he saw his son's twisted body laying face down in the water. He reached down and hauled the little body out onto his lap. The water was now stone cold, and Jon knew that his little boy must have been like this for some time. Robbie's face was bloated, his skin blotchy and deathly white. Jon opened his mouth to scream, but no sounds left his lips. He pulled the boy in close and held his limp, soaking body to his chest. He shut his eyes and squeezed the dead child tightly, the pain building up inside him like a geyser, readying itself to explode. After a few moments, he opened his eyes again, his anguished cries suddenly becoming cries of shock and terror as he recoiled backwards, still gripping the lifeless body in his arms. He could see her. Before him, standing in the doorway, was a pale, gaunt young girl. He guessed no more than 15 or so. She was dripping wet, her body broken, her snowy white skin blotchy and swollen. She raised a hand to point a bent white finger at him, the nails dirty, cracked and splintered. Slowly, she stepped forward. Behind the long, matted wet hair that clung to her face, her sunken, misty grey eyes bulged. They seemed to stream with tears as they locked onto him. Her mouth opened wide, her lips cracking and tearing in several places as she let out an impossibly loud, low moan that made Jon's brain rattle within his skull. He raised one hand to his forehead and shut his eyes tight, gripping his teeth against the growing pain in his head. Something impossibly cold and wet touched his wrist, and he opened his eyes for a moment. The girl pulled his hand away from his face. The noise she was making was becoming louder as she lowered herself onto his lap, swamping the body of his son. Her free hand reached behind him, grasping at his hair and yanking back his head as she leaned in and placed her ruined mouth against his. Salt water spilled from the girl's maw, filling Jon's lungs and throat until it gushed from his own mouth and poured down his cheeks and neck. He tried to struggle, but she only gripped him tighter until he was on the very brink of unconsciousness. Then suddenly, she released her grip and slowly backed away from him. Jon collapsed onto his belly, choking as he impossibly coughed up seawater over the bathroom floor. He clawed his way over the body of his son and past the crooked frame of the young girl to the open doorway. Once through to the landing, he attempted to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold his weight, and he crumpled back to the floor with a pitiful thump. Slowly, he tried to pull himself to the top of the stairs before looking back towards the bathroom. Of the girl he could see nothing, but his eyes lingered upon the small body of Robbie, laying in a heap upon the bathroom floor. His head twisted obscenely to face him, his mouth ajar, and his eyes wide and staring accusingly back at his father. Jon tried to move towards his son, but suddenly cried out as an intense pain tore through his side. He looked down to find a pale, delicate hand gripping below his rib cage. A dark red stain began to appear where the fingers dug into his flesh, and before he could even react, he felt a force send him tumbling down the stairs to land in a heap at the bottom. Winded, bloody and aching, Jon reached the door and heaved himself to his feet. His head swam, his entire body ached, and he suddenly felt nauseous. He opened the front door and stepped out into the cold night air, before doubling over and vomiting a mixture of blood, bile and tea. At the front gate of the garden, he saw the girl. She beckoned for him to follow. He took a step backwards towards the door, and she let out an ear-piercing scream that dropped him to his knees. Once the screaming had stopped, he opened his eyes to see her once again, waving him forward. Jon struggled to his feet as she moved past the gate and onto the pavement beyond. Reluctantly, Jon followed her. Wednesday, the 13th of March 1991. The dimly lit suburbs were deserted as Jon stumbled along the road after the ghostly figure. His breath escaped him in thick clouds of mist as he struggled to suck in the biting cold air. On and on he walked, slowly and painfully. He looked down at his almost ruined socks that failed to protect his feet from the stone and debris that covered the pavement. After almost an hour of following the girl through the gloomy Copperport streets, he found himself staggering into Crest Place. "What are we doing here?" he croaked. But the girl seemed to either not hear him or ignore him altogether. She continued to number 19 and moved towards the house. Jon quickened his pace, trying to ignore the pain that lanced through him. Upon reaching the driveway of his grandfather's house, he scanned the area. He noticed that his brother's light blue car was missing, and the front door was gaping wide open. Jon cursed to himself and hurried up to the house. He had to make sure his old granddad was all right. The lights were all off, and when Jon arrived at the door, he looked up the stairs to see a dark, shadowy figure glaring at him. Even through the almost pitch darkness, he could feel her gaze bearing down. "Please," his voice sounded small and pathetic. "Don't hurt him." She turned away from him and moved out of sight. As he struggled to follow her, he realized that she had moved away from his grandfather's door. When he arrived at the top of the stairs, he could see her standing outside his brother's room, the meager moonlight that pierced the gloom making her perfectly visible as she stared at him from the doorway. After a moment, she turned to enter the bedroom, disappearing into the total darkness. Looking inside, he could see nothing. He reached out a hand, found the light switch and flicked it on. He was blinded suddenly as the bulb hanging from the ceiling illuminated his surroundings. After a few moments his eyes adapted, and he could see that Tom, as always, still kept his room immaculately tidy. Everything was put away, or stored neatly upon the shelves and desk that stood beside his tall wardrobe. The ghostly figure now stood at the foot of his brother's bed, her hideously contorted arm pointing a gnarled finger down towards the space below. Gingerly, Jon limped into the room. Leaning on the mattress, he lowered himself slowly to the floor. He stretched his arm out under the bed until his fingers brushed against something. A shoebox, it felt like. He fumbled to get a hold of it, and eventually dragged it clear of the bed. He removed the lid of the box and gasped at what he saw within. Photographs, dozens of them, all perfectly stacked. He took a handful and began to look through them, allowing each one to drop to the floor as he went. Each of the photographs were of the same young girl, in various states of undress. The face that looked back at him was filled with terror and despair. As he filtered through the pictures, he suddenly realized he knew the poor child. Jon felt sick again. A dark-haired, pretty girl, no more than 15. The same girl he had seen in the photograph at the police station. He looked up at the broken figure that stood before him. "It's you." His words were nothing more than a mumble. His jaw ached when he moved it, and he suspected that, as well as his nose, it may be broken. Again the girl pointed down, this time directly at the box between his knees. He emptied it of the remaining photos. Beneath them was a videotape. Jon crawled painfully across the room to the desk. He switched on both the television and the VCR, before fumbling the cassette into the slot. The machine made a loud whirring sound as the tape loaded into position, and he pressed play. The television sprung to life, and Jon's heart dropped into his stomach. There, upon the screen, was his daughter, his little Emily. For only a few seconds he watched what was happening, and as the tears welled in her eyes, he slammed his finger onto the stop button. The screen went dark. "Jon?" came a familiar voice behind him. Jon turned awkwardly to his brother, his face a mask of pure hatred, his eyes burning with malice. He tried to rise, his body screaming at him in resistance. Pain seared through him with the effort. Finally, he managed to lift himself into a crouch. Tom stepped forward, and in the blink of an eye, he was standing above his older brother. And without hesitation, he delivered a hard thrusting kick to Jon's head. The blow caught Jon in the temple, driving his head into the screen of the television, which cracked on impact as Jon crumpled to the floor. Slowly, Jon opened his eyes. By the moment, he felt pain in more and more of his body, as a strong bitter wind swept over him as he lay motionless upon the floor. No, not the floor. He was lying face down on grass, his head suddenly filled with a thunderous noise, like some nightmarish leviathan roaring in his ears. Hands grasped in under his armpits, and he felt himself lifted from the damp earth. He raised his eyes to see where he was being dragged, his head feeling like it might split in two. Before him was only a few feet of grass. Then the world dropped off into the crashing waves and rocks below. "No!" he blurted out, as he clawed for clumps of the grass below him. The hands that gripped him let him go, and he planted face first into the earth. Struggling, he rolled onto his back, the effort taking everything that he had left. His brother appeared next to him, his features obscured in shadow under the light of the crescent moon. "Tom?" Jon whispered the word. "What are you doing?" Tom did not answer. He pulled Jon up into a sitting position, causing him to cry out. Tom placed a knee firmly in his older brother's spine and yanked back his head. He gazed, his head swimming at the stars, before he felt a glass bottle touch his lips. Liquid poured down his throat, biting as it went, like some kind of acrid poison. Jon coughed and spluttered, but the liquid kept coming. "Just drink it," came the familiar sound of his little brother's voice. "It'll make this easier." Lacking the strength to fight, all Jon could do was cough up as much of the vile substance as he could, but too much of it found its way down into his stomach, burning his chest with each mouthful. After several minutes, the liquor finally ran dry. Tom placed Jon's hands upon the bottle, before nonchalantly tossing it away to land upon the grass, just away from the cliff's edge. Jon noticed then that the younger man was wearing gloves. No fingerprints, he thought. He's really going to do it. He's really going to kill me. He tried to struggle once more, but it was useless. His brother sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. He shook his head before wiping at his eyes with his sleeve. "I'm sorry, Johnny," he said, "but I've got no choice now." Tom slammed his fist down upon the ground. Damn it, bro. Why were you sneaking around in my stuff? The anger began to swell up within him as he spoke. This is all your fault, not mine. Emily, came Jon's somewhat pitiful reply. What did you do? Tom released his grip, allowing his brother to fall back to the ground. Tell me. Somehow Jon's words were now a shout, and he spat them with vitriol. Tom seemed to ignore the question as he grabbed a handful of Jon's shirt collar and began to pull. I'll look after Robbie for you, he said, as he heaved the older man inch by inch towards the edge. Robbie's dead. The reply fell from his mouth, his voice quivering at the sight of his little boy's body flooding back into his mind. Tom stopped pulling for a moment. How? You told me about her. Jon mumbled the words, and she drowned him. Told you about who? Tom seemed angry, as well as confused. A sudden light flickered into life within Jon's mind. Sarah saw a girl out on the rocks at Maiden's Point. She told Robbie she'd seen a girl, and then she died. The thoughts were exploding through his brain as the impossible happenings of the night started to make some kind of twisted sense. She wants you. Jon's words were firm. He suffered the pain as he looked up into the face of his would-be killer, the younger brother he'd spent so much of his life looking out for. What the hell are you talking about? Snapped Tom, losing his patience. Jon's eyes glazed over as they filled with tears, but he saw her, blurred and insubstantial, but most definitely here. Amelia, he said simply. Shut up. Tom spat the words down into Jon's face as he continued to pull. She's dead. Emily's dead. They're all dead. She's here for you, brother. I can see her. Jon began to cry as the girl moved forward. She reached out to him, and he knew what must happen now. Her broken fingers slid delicately over Jon's face, coming to rest upon his eyes. She smiled at him kindly, before pressing her filthy nails into his sockets. The soft tissue of his eyeballs slid to one side as her fingers drove into his skull before popping over like ripe grapes. Jon howled in agony as Tom dropped him back to the ground, backing away from what he was seeing. Out of nowhere, his brother's eyes had just exploded from his skull. He stood aghast, watching Jon scream as blood oozed from the destroyed sockets, before his entire face collapsed in on itself with a sickening crunch. And then, the screaming stopped. Tom stood wide-mouthed, staring at the still corpse that had once been his older brother. He tried to rationalize in his mind what he'd just seen, but it was too much. He took a breath, rubbed at the back of his neck, and approached the body. He nudged at Jon with his foot, and when nothing happened, he leaned over and finished dragging him to the edge of the cliff. I love you, he whispered, before rolling what was left of Jon over the edge and watching him fall into the raging darkness below. After a moment of reflection, he stood, turned from the cliff edge, and began his short walk back across the grass. He stopped as something caught his eye over in the direction of his car. A movement. Someone was walking towards him. The shape of a slender-framed girl became apparent as he drew closer to her. His mind raced. He couldn't afford any witnesses. But why would she be out here at this early hour? She would have to be dealt with too, and it would need to be done here and now. A smile crept to the edges of his mouth. I hope she's pretty, he thought to himself. As she came within a dozen or so feet, his smile began to fade. He tried to speak, but no words ventured from his lips. He recognized this girl. She was twisted and broken, but he still recognized her. Amelia Collingwood. He'd enjoyed her months ago. Pretty, shy, and too afraid to fight. But how could she be here? She was dead. He held up his hand to ward her off, clenching his fist, ready to strike at her, but she continued forward regardless. Then her mouth opened. Her eyes rolled back in their sockets, and his head was filled with impossible noise.
Just look at this shithole. Do you think anyone even lives here?
What do you see is?
It's a crappy abandoned cellar in a crappy abandoned house. What did you expect?
This place makes me uncomfortable. I swear, today can just do one.